Today we are continuing a sermon series that we're doing out of Revelation chapter 2 and 3 primarily. And in Revelation chapter 2, we find some letters that Jesus writes through John to 7 churches in Asia, which at the time was in Asia. Now it's in Turkey. All these 7 cities we find in Turkey. Last week we read the letter to Ephesus. And this week we're going to be going up the road to Smyrna. Now if you see Patmos is on the bottom, that black dot, that's where John received the word from God and wrote the letters from. And these are the 7 churches that Jesus specifically addressed and wrote letters to. Smyrna in ancient times was a very wealthy and powerful port city. You can see where it's at in that location in the world. It at actually 2 different times was a very powerful port city. In 600 BC, the Lydian king Attalus was so jealous of this city that he attacked it and destroyed it and basically brought it down to rubble. It was just a little village after Attalus was done attacking this city. However, another man decided that was a great location and he wanted a city there. So Alexander the Great decided, I'm going to come and I'm going to bring this city that was dead back to life. In fact, that's one of the themes, if you look through the history of this town, that there's lots of references to resurrection, or a city that was dead and came back to life. Smyrna is now located in the modern city of Izmir, and you can actually travel to this city and find the ruins of Smyrna inside it. All these beautiful structures that were commissioned by Alexander the Great. They still find lots of these intact stones, and it's a very beautiful place to visit. Very wealthy town. And again, there's this idea of death back to life. And that's especially interesting because something I found out about this town that I didn't know before this past week is that Smyrna had the exclusive rights for the import and export of myrrh. Myrrh came from Smyrna. You can imagine the amount of brain power that came into naming that town, right? It's like, let's name it after myrrh. Yeah, let's name it something like Smyrna. It's like, all right, nailed it. Myrrh is one of the 3 gifts that were given to the baby Jesus when he was born from the wise men. It's really interesting because it was fragrances that was used when preparing a body for burial. So again, we have that image of death to life, and even in Jesus, we see that he was given myrrh, death, but he came back to life as well. Now, while the city of Smyrna had a rich cultural background, there's great stories around this town, but only if you're looking from the cultural standpoint, right? If you're looking from the Roman standpoint, this is a great place. If you're looking from the people who grew up there and were kind of caught up in the Greek culture and then adopted by the Romans, they loved this town. They loved the story of this town. There was one group that really found this town difficult for them, and that were the Christians. The Christians were constantly persecuted in Smyrna. It was a port city like Ephesus, and there were temples and even trade unions that were dedicated to many gods of the various pantheons, whether Greek or Roman. Everything was tied to the worship of these different gods. And it's difficult for a people who worship the one true God to live. In fact, I read something this week. I've never heard this before. I heard that the people in Smyrna referenced the Christians as atheists, because they believed in all of these gods and they only believed in this one. So to that people, the Christians were the atheists. And again, I've never heard that before, but either it's an interesting thought. How life has changed in the world, huh? The church was looked down upon. They were falsely accused over various things, and they weren't prospering. They were struggling in this town, and that's the conditions when Jesus, through John, writes this letter to the church. In Revelation 2, verse 8, it says this: "To the angel of the church of Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So as I mentioned last week, most of these letters follow a specific formula, like lots of writings in the New Testament. There's commendations, there's things you're doing well, then there's criticisms, things you're not doing well, then there's some advice, and then there's a reward. It's going to be a little bit different for the church in Smyrna. It starts with some commendations, but it's kind of inferred commendations, and there's actually no criticisms. Instead, there's a warning. But to start this letter, Jesus, he's kind of commending them for their endurance of these trials, but he's saying, I see you in them. I know your tribulation, your poverty, though you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. God sees our struggles and our successes. God sees the things that are coming against us, and God sees the things that we are enduring, the things that we are succeeding in. This group had been facing tribulation. They were, in a worldly sense, impoverished. They were poor. They had been slandered against by the people of the town. And what we haven't read yet, but is in the next verse we're going to find out, it's about to get worse for them. Things are only going downhill. God saw the struggles of the people of Smyrna, and they were big struggles. Imagine taking a stand as a follower of Jesus in the Roman Empire and how that could lead to poor business. They couldn't enter any of the trade guilds or anything like that, because to enter specific guilds, you had to declare that you worshiped the god of that trade company. So you couldn't trade with other people. You couldn't align yourself unless you said, well, I'm going to worship whatever god this is. And so because of that, they were very limited in business. They weren't getting the same deals as other people. People treated them more harshly, made them pay more for things. And because of this, they were struggling in a financial way. They also received slander. They were people saying horrible things against the Christians. And in fact, it wasn't just from the what we would call the pagan people. It was from the people who referred to themselves as Jews, even though God said they aren't really Jewish people. It's interesting because when you research the history and letters from the early church, you can find out that one of the accusations made by this synagogue against the Christian people were that when they partook in communion, they were literally eating the body of Christ and drinking his blood. But they didn't explain what they were doing or how they did it, and so basically they were accusing the Christians of being cannibals to the Romans. And even in that society, that was frowned upon. So that's the slander they're receiving. They're like, hey, these Christians, they're cannibals. They're doing evil, terrible, blood sacrifice stuff, and they need to be arrested because of this. They're a danger to our culture. They're a danger to... And again, that's the people who are supposed to be the chosen ones of God saying it. And what did Jesus say about them? He called them a synagogue of Satan. Jesus said, I see your struggles, but he sees more. He says, I know your poverty, but you are rich. I know your poverty, but you are rich. While you may not have much money or position or influence, you have wealth in ways that they won't even understand. You have wealth that they can't even relate to. They have God on their side, the Creator, the one who can provide for any need. If we have Christ, we cannot be poor. And that's what God is saying to this church. You may not have anything, but you are not poor. Not in a way that really matters. We may be broke, but we're not poor. Right? We may not be able to go out to eat after church, but we're still not poor, okay? They were alone in that city. They had no support. Even others who believed in the one true God began attacking them. But they weren't alone because God saw them. God saw what they were going through. He saw their struggles. He also saw their successes. They were gracefully enduring suffering. They stood firm in a city that was constantly attacking them. God knew, and he was there for them. In 2 Chronicles 16, it says, "The eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless towards him." In other words, if you honor him with all of your choices, if you stand firm even in a city that isn't going to appreciate what you're doing, if you're struggling because of holding on to your values, God is for you and he will be with you. There may be difficulties, but God sees you. He knows your struggles and your successes, and he will give his strong support. Now, this is the part of the story where, because God says, "Hey, I see you, I know your struggles," this is the part where we like, all right, this is where God's going to intervene and immediately fix all the problems, and it's going to be a happy ending, and we can pray and go. But that's not what happens here. God says, "I see your struggles, I know your endurance, however." Again, there's no criticism coming, but here's his warning. In verse 10, it says, "Do not fear," which is always a bad sign. Actually, sometimes it's a good sign, but here it's a bad sign. "Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation." So instead of a criticism, Jesus prophesies a warning to them. Hey, just so you know, the devil is going to attack your church, and some of you will go to prison. I see what you're going through. I also see what is going to happen to you. The enemy is going to put you in jail where your faith will be tested. God sees what you're going through. He can see what will happen to you in the future. That's the good news. That's the good news. He isn't surprised by anything. He knows, he understands, and this is if you have notes, this is the big point here. God wants us to look to him in our weakness. He doesn't say, "I'm going to immediately remove you from your trials," but he does want us to look to him in our weakness. In our weak moments, in our trials, when our faith is being tested, look to him. Sometimes we feel like giving up. We've been making a stand on something, but it seems like nobody thinks this way anymore. Nobody does these things anymore. Is it even worth arguing? Is it even worth taking a stand for this thing? I'm doing my best and things only get worse. I'm trying to make the right choices and it feels like my situation has worsened. Isn't God supposed to get us out of these difficult situations? When we stand firm, isn't he supposed to immediately bless us and help us get through this thing? When we are in a trial, we often want an immediate solution. We want a get out of jail free card, right? Because we worship the God who can do anything. So we feel entitled sometimes, even entitled, to being like, all right, God, I did the right thing. I said the right thing. Get me out of this right now, please. We have to remember that Jesus came to earth and he went through trials. He suffered. He was falsely accused. He was betrayed by those close to him. And God didn't just pull him out of it. He sent him through those trials knowing what would happen, what the outcome would be. Jesus even prayed, "Take this cup from me." Jesus even wanted a way out of the most painful parts, and God didn't pull him out. Hebrews 14 talks about this. It says, we have a high priest we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect was tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. This tells us that Jesus understands how difficult it is to be in these situations. It's like, listen, you're going to go to jail. It's going to be hard. Your faith is going to be tested, and I can sympathize with you in that trial. I know what you're like. I literally, truly know what you're going through because I went through it too. What should we do? With confidence, draw near the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace. When we're in the middle of the trial, look to God, approach God. When we are weak, look to our strong God. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul Paul is telling us about how he had a thorn in his side. Now, lots of people have talked about this. If you've heard us, Pastor, I talk about this, we've told you probably every time. We don't actually know what this thorn is. We have good reason to believe it's not a literal, actual thorn in his side. It's something else that he's being purposefully vague about. It was probably like somebody's spouse or something like that, and he just didn't want to name names in the Bible. We don't know who. We don't know if it was a person. We don't know if it was a thing, if it was a trial. We don't know what it is. But he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord that it should leave me. I pleaded, get me out of this situation, God, 3 times. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. He goes on to say, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insult, hardship, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. This doesn't make sense unless our strength comes from the Lord. He says, I am content with weakness. I am content with insults, hardship, persecutions, and calamities. Can any of us truly say that? I am content when people insult me. Just sitting here in peace. Bring it on. Just let all you've got. Persecution, calamity, sure, why not? Just come on. I'm content. I'm content. This is a very difficult statement from Paul. It's hard, but there's wisdom in it. Because when we are weak, when we know that we're weak, when we know that I can't just Dave's strength fight through this, then we rely on God's power and we realize how much stronger that is than Dave's power anyway. When we are weak, then we are truly strong. Now, it's true all the time. We could always rely on God's strength. But it's when we are weak, when we're desperate, that we look to God for His strength sometimes. He knows our weakness. He can even sympathize with our weakness. He can understand it. He can look at us and be like, poor, sad, weak Dave. I get it. I get it. He knows what we're going, like truly. He wouldn't say it like that probably. But He can see us and understand and sympathize with it. When you are weak, look to God for strength. Jesus Himself had to do this. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Then the second part of verse 10, it says this, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So, I see your trials. You're going to go to jail, and your faith is going to be tested. Be faithful unto death. It's not a very cheerful letter here, and it has some implications. What's his counsel here to the church? What's his advice to them? Be faithful. Be faithful. He knows our struggles. He sympathizes with them. He wants us to look for Him to strength, but on our end, as far as our responsibility goes, we must be faithful. Now, faithfulness springs from faith. When we have faith, when we have a foundation, faithfulness can spring from that. It's something that we build, that faithfulness we can stand on. To be faithful, we need rock solid faith. Or the more rock solid, the better, at the very least. We need to know that the best thing for us is to stand in our faith. If we're going to be persecuted and people say, if you deny Jesus, you get to live, it's pretty hard to stand in that if your faith in Jesus and what He's done isn't rock solid. That's when people are more like, well, I'm going to just lie now and then I'm going to ask Jesus for forgiveness when I get back home. But when we read through history, when we read through these stories, that's not what Jesus is asking us to do. He's asking us to stand firm, to be faithful. Is it better to cave under the pressure so our immediate circumstances get easier, or to stand firm in our faith, trusting that the end result is much better no matter what it is. Faith will be tested, and if it immediately caves, it was pretty worthless faith. Honestly. The people in this church in Smyrna were about to be sent to prison for their faith. They would be asked to renounce their faith so they could live. That's what happened. They said, if you deny Christ, if you hail Lord Caesar, or whatever they made them say, if you say Caesar is God and you renounce Christ, we'll let you live. That's what their reality was. That was the trial that they were about to face. Jesus warned them that it would happen, and it did happen. Jesus' instruction, be faithful even unto death. The third point for our message today is that we need to stand firm no matter the cost. To be a follower of Jesus, we need a faith that doesn't waver, that doesn't crumble when it's tested. We need to stand firm to be faithful no matter the cost. One of the most incredible side stories to our passage today, it's not in Scripture, but it's a story about a man who you may be familiar with if you've studied early church history or theology very much. There's a man whose name was Polycarp of Smyrna. He was the head of the church in Smyrna. Now, we don't know if it was at the exact time that Jesus, or if he's just writing for a time in the future. But Jesus is writing to this church in Smyrna, and this man is one of the heads of this church in the first century. He was one of the very first in the church patriarchal age following the apostles, one of the first leaders following the apostles of the church. In fact, there's some evidence that Polycarp was trained by one of the apostles as well. And this man was the bishop of Smyrna, which, as we've already mentioned, is today Izmir. And he was part of a generation of church leaders who succeeded the apostles. And he was martyred before the period of the great persecution. So after this, okay, spoilers, he's going to die in the end. He was faithful unto death. But this is even before the great persecution by Rome, when Rome specifically went out and tried to arrest and kill Christians. He was one of the first. So Polycarp is in this church that we've just read about. We know it's a town that doesn't treat Christians well, doesn't respond well to their teachings, doesn't like anything that's going on with the church. And Polycarp was a faithful man. The proconsul eventually found out where he was, and he sent some soldiers to arrest him. So the story goes, and the story was actually written by his church after his death, by the way. They wrote the story of what's about to happen, and they sent it to all the other churches to encourage him. So it's pretty interesting. So Polycarp was at his home or somewhere, resting, and the soldiers come in. He comes down to greet them, and they say, "Hey, we're here to arrest you." He said, I'm not going to fight. God's will be done. However, if you're amenable to this, I'm going to have my servants feed you some dinner, and I'd like just 1 hour to be able to pray before you take me. And they granted him his wish. So these soldiers are eating in this house, and Polycarp goes and he prays for 1 hour. And the story goes that they heard his prayer for that hour, and they were so moved by his prayer that they begged him to just give in to the demands so that he could be saved. It says there, the chief of police was named Herod, and his father Nicetas brought the carriage that they were going to use to take him to the proconsul, and both of these men tried to persuade him. They said, "What harm is there in saying Lord Caesar and offering a sacrifice and saving yourself from death?" They begged him. And he refused. So he gets before the proconsul, and the proconsul urged him. He said, "Take this oath and I'll let you go. Curse Christ." And this was his response: 86 years I have served my master. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? 86 years I've served my master. How can I deny him now? The proconsul kept insisting, swear by the divine power of Caesar. And he responds again, he says, listen, if you vainly think that I will swear by the divine power of Caesar, and you say that if I pretend that you do not know who I am, listen plainly, I'll tell you who I am. I'm a Christian. And if you wish to learn the Christian message, arrange a meeting and give me a hearing. So he's like, deny that you're a Christian. He's like, no, listen, once and for all, I'm a Christian. I'll happily tell you about Christ. The proconsul didn't give up, though. He said, listen, I've got wild animals. I'll throw you to the wild animals. Just stood there. Nope. It's like, okay, I'm going to have you burned alive if you don't change your mind. And he still wasn't moved. So eventually the proconsul, astonished that he refused to give up in his faith, said, Polycarp has declared that he is a Christian. He had the herald announce it to all the people, and they all demanded that he be burned alive, all the people of the city. So they put everything together. They were going to actually nail his hands to the post, and he said, you don't have to do that. I'll stand here. And so they just tied him up and put him in the fire. And as the story goes, they lit the fire, and the fire did not touch his body. And so they tried to burn him alive, and he wouldn't burn alive. So finally the proconsul said, somebody. So they went and somebody grabbed a dagger and they stabbed him, and then he did die. But here's a man who maybe, and again, I don't know this for sure, maybe this is the exact situation that Jesus was thinking of when he gave the letter to John to give to the church in Smyrna. It's that first generation church. He might have been thinking about Polycarp as he wrote the letter to them. Stand firm even until death. And he did. One of the things that we see in Scripture when it comes to prophecy is that prophecy often has an imminent application. So it hasn't happened yet, but it's coming soon. There's some practical application things that anybody at any time can learn. And then there's future applications as well. So in our story, I think that this story of Polycarp is the imminent application of the prophecy. Write it to the church in Smyrna. That's where he led, was in Smyrna. I think that could have been the immediate prophecy that was fulfilled through his life. There was a reason Jesus had John write this letter to that specific church. Even in the letter, he says, for 10 days you will have tribulation. I thought that was interesting. So 10 days exactly, and I found out it's an idiom at the time that means for a little while. It doesn't mean 10 days, it means for a little while. It's like, you'll have tribulation for a bit, but it won't last forever. I think the story of Polycarp was part of the imminent application. Jesus sent this letter to Smyrna, where Polycarp read, preached, and then lived it. The early church suffered lots of persecution under the Roman Empire, but it didn't last forever. Jesus was warning the early church that the persecution was coming, and he was telling them ahead of time so they could prepare and be faithful through it. There's also general application, I think. Be faithful unto death is a specific requirement, not just for the early church, but for every follower of Jesus. To a greater or more likely a lesser degree, many Christians, many churches will endure suffering or tribulations. This is true, and despite the magnitude of the tribulation, it is a requirement of us to be faithful, whether it's the same kind of tribulations they faced then or not. This is a general application of the prophecy for us today. Whatever we go through, God still expects us to remain faithful to Him, to stand firm in our faith in those moments. There's also future application and end time application. This is Revelation at all, it is Revelation after all. So it's talking about the end of times where the great tribulation occurs, where the second coming occurs, where the millennial reign occurs. It's talking to a future church that will experience it again. In fact, it's not the first time Jesus even prophesies about it. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 9, Jesus is prophesying about this future end times church that will suffer. He says, "They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another." So even his church is going to fall, part of it will fall away, and they'll turn on each other and fight each other. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So what's the message here? Whether you're in Polycarp's church in Smyrna, a person attending Spirit Life on April 21st, 2024, or a part of the last church age, the last generation Christian living in the moments before the prophesied end times, Jesus' message to you is be faithful. Is it possible that we're even now approaching those final moments? Could we be that church? It's possible, but as far as it matters to us, it doesn't matter a whole lot. Because Jesus' message to all of his church is the same. Tribulations will come, be faithful. Our role, no matter where we are in history, is to share the gospel and be faithful. If the end begins in a year or in 1,000 years, my role is to tell people what God has done for me and to be faithful to him. And it's not always going to be easy. Matthew 7 talks about people who say, "Lord, we did these things in your name," and he says, "I don't know who you are." In verse 13 it says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter it are many. But the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." Jesus says this isn't going to be easy. You need to be faithful. Tribulations will come. You need to be faithful. Faithfulness in tribulation is hard. Standing firm through famine, through trial, through adversity, it isn't easy. Remain faithful, because the results make it all worth it. In the second half of verse 10, it says, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." So here's the reward. The reward is eternity with God. Whatever trial we face in this life, the reward for remaining faithful is eternity with God. Be faithful, and I will give you the crown of life. The reward of the faithful is the crown of life. The reward of the faithful is the crown of life. We receive eternity with God, but here it also talks about a crown. In fact, if you read through the New Testament, it speaks of five separate crowns. The crown of life, the incorruptible crown, the crown of righteousness, the crown of glory, the crown of exaltation. We don't know for sure if it's all one crown, if it is five specific achievements that God gives people who've gone through certain things. But what we know about the crown of life is it's also by theologians called the martyr's crown. And it's referenced here in Revelation 2, but also in James 1:12. And the context implies that Jesus gives this crown to those who persevere under trials. It's the crown he gives to people who have suffered, who have gone through the worst of it, but they remained faithful to him. The James verse says this, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Remain faithful, and the reward is worth it. The crown of life. And then it goes on to say, "Though the one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." And if you're reading, you're like, all right, let's talk about that for a minute. What is the second death? The second death is referenced later in Revelation 21, verses 7 through 8. It says, "The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son." Again, they'll receive the crown of life, eternity with God. "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, all of the liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." What is the second death? The second death is a final, eternal separation from God. The second death, or what many call the eternal death, is the ultimate form of separation from God. If a person is already spiritually dead and they die a second time, they will be forever separated from God. This is definitely an example of the rewards outweigh the cost situations. No matter how hard things get in this life, the rewards far outweigh it. The cost is high, the way is difficult, the reward is worth it. If we think we can get by being mostly faithful, we may be gambling with our eternity. Again, we were joking before service when we always, with the worship team, we pray and we talk about, somebody's like fire and brimstone, someone's like no, and it's like, oh, kind of yes. I'm going to reference Revelation 21. It's not good. And I'm not one of those guys who's like, I want to threaten you with the negative situation and get you in fear to respond to it. I want you to respond to God's love and purpose for you. So that's why we don't do a whole lot of fire and brimstone stuff here. However, this is reality. This is truth. Those who remain faithful receive God. If we think we can bargain or reason with God about why we were faithful enough, we probably will not win. If we think a technicality will get us through, we'll be wrong. I read this week about a man who is a prisoner in Iowa, and he made the news because he was given a life sentence. And in March 2015, he had a series of complications from kidney stones, and he went into septic shock. And they ran this man to the hospital where he died briefly before the doctors brought him back to life. They got his heart beating again, and so they revived him. Now this man, in his cleverness, argued with a judge in an appeal that he had technically served his life sentence. He said, I served my jail sentence until I died, and I think I should be released from prison now, which I think is hilarious. I love this story. It is so funny. His attorneys argued that his momentary death meant that he had completed his life sentence, and his return to prison was therefore illegal. So a court of 3 judges read the appeal, and they went through it, and they found his argument unpersuasive and without merit. Their conclusion read, Schreiber is either still alive, in which case he must remain in prison, or he is actually dead, in which case this appeal is moot. So it's a life sentence, so if he's alive, the sentence is still there. At the time I read this, he was 66, and he's still in prison in Iowa. But it kind of shows how weak our arguments before God might be if we say, well, technically we met the requirements. God, I said Jesus is Lord. I believe that you are who the Bible says you are. And he's like, but you didn't remain faithful. Technically, God, I did say that prayer. Technically, God, I was faithful 82% of the time. Technically, God, and it's like James 1:12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. So here's our application for today. First, prepare yourself for attacks from the enemy. Prepare yourself for attacks from the enemy. This is why Jesus warned the church. Hey, this is coming. Prepare yourself mentally, spiritually, emotionally. If you know that you're going to go into jail, you might want to begin mentally preparing yourself for that, right? I am not trained in lots of warfare or anything like that, but I do know that you shouldn't wait until you're being attacked to start building a fortress around yourself. If you wait till the attack's already there, it's not going to be very effective. Prepare yourself for the attacks of the enemy. Jesus says they will come to the people in his church. Prepare yourselves now while you can, before the attacks come. If you want to remain faithful, it's best if you now have a strong prayer life. If you are confident in God, I tell you what, it's a lot easier to go to jail and trust God when you know you're innocent, right? If we prepare our hearts before God, we can trust that even in those situations, we at least have him on our side. No matter what man says, we can go in with a clear conscience. Secondly, look to God to be your defense. Look to God to be your defense. God doesn't say, prepare yourself so you can fight back. Prepare yourself for a prison break. Polycarp never once argued for a release. Disciples in jail didn't try a prison break. In fact, they were in jail just singing praises to God. I want to be a righteous man who is a man after God's heart and does things the right way, but I just can't imagine being falsely accused and going to jail and being like, the joy of the Lord is my strength. You know? I hope to be that kind of person. We can do it when we trust God to be our defense, when we don't have to be our own defense, when we don't have to fight back, when we don't have to clear our own name. We may feel attacked. Spend some time in worship. It's way better than plotting a rebuttal or revenge. Spend some time in prayer. Look to God to be your defense. And lastly, remain faithful no matter what. No matter what you face, no matter how difficult, prepare yourself, and in those moments, look to God and say, God, this is really hard. I am feeling very tempted and weak right now. I need your strength to get through this. Look to him for strength, but stand firm. Stand firm. Lord, I pray that